Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. This is episode number 2 this week. I highly encourage you check out episode number 1 if you happen to missed it. It went live on Tuesday. We had former Nittany Lions starting offensive lineman Landon Tengwall on the show with us. He's done great work early in his career in media since having to medically retire from football in 2023. And we spent about an hour just breaking down this Penn State program, expectations across the football field. Obviously, we spent some time detailing the offensive line development. Landon knows that really well, but a lot of focus on Drew Allar as a leader, a lot of focus on different position groups, and ultimately some big picture conversation about how this program is developing and trending in 2025. So circle back, hear what Landon had to say with us for about an hour on Tuesday's episode. We are, as promised, going to focus in on Las Vegas for this episode, and that's where we're going to find our buddy Daniel Gallen right now joining us from Las Vegas. You can see Mandalay Bay Casino Resort in the background if you're watching on YouTube, and that's where it's all taking place this year. Whether you like it or not, that's where Big Ten Media Days 2025 have landed. Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen have been doing a great job covering things as they've progressed over in Las Vegas for us. Coverage at Lions247.com throughout the week. We've got a bunch of stories and video up from Wednesday, which is when Penn State was in the spotlight. So first and foremost, Daniel, I know it's still morning over there. It's afternoon here in central Pennsylvania, but thanks for hopping on with us, and good work from you and Mark. I know people might be wondering, where is Mark? Well, he stayed up. He pulled an all-nighter, getting a bunch of content over to the site. So I think he's catching up on some rest, and we can carry it, just the two of us here on this episode.
Definitely. It's good to be on this morning. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm sacrificing some of the good lighting for the backdrop, so you can see the Mandalay Bay, the hotel part of the resort, and we're over in the convention center, and it's been a very I think it's been a productive 2 days so far. We got one more day left today. I've got some questions to ask some other programs from around the Big Ten, and we'll see what else comes from it. I think I've gotten some fun and interesting feedback from around the conference these past few days.
Yeah, and it's not just Penn State focus for Daniel and Mark out there. They've been talking to other people. Daniel had a story up actually on Tuesday night with Ohio State defenders, really praising Jim Knowles for what he meant to their national championship run. Some really good perspective there. I know you'll have a chance to pick the brains of other players and coaches from the Big Ten here on Thursday as we record. This episode will go live on Friday. But why don't you just set the scene for us for Wednesday? I've covered this event in Chicago. I've covered it in Indianapolis. I've never covered it in Las Vegas. No one's ever covered Big Ten Media Days in Las Vegas. Let's take you back to last year, of course. 4 teams from the West Coast jump over from the Pac-12, UCLA, USC, Washington, Oregon. The Ducks ultimately won the Big Ten championship in year 1. And so it goes from a regional conference, very large regional conference, to a true coast-to-coast national conference, and lands in Las Vegas for Media Days. So tell us what it looked like, how it was a bit different, aside from the fact that you guys were in the desert instead of the Midwest.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti made a comment during his big press conference on Tuesday that it doesn't seem like this is going to become the norm. It seemed like this was a little bit of a one-off in having it in Vegas. I think the one thing that stands out to me about this event, and it's something that James Franklin mentioned, is that if you're just here, you don't really know that the Big Ten is here. When you talk about going to Indianapolis, you get off your plane and you're walking through the airport, and they've got a big display set up, of like welcoming the Big Ten, the JW Marriott, that hotel where
we're talking about in the airport, just to emphasize, like you get into the Indianapolis airport, and I remember like going down the escalator and just seeing like a Big Ten football helmet like on the wall, and like, okay, this is a big deal in city right now.
Yeah, and you go to the JW Marriott. That's where all the teams and the players are staying, and they've got a ton of Big Ten signage, all the logos. Around town, they have all the logos, and then just on the outside of Lucas Oil Stadium, they've got huge Big Ten signage, and it's pretty much like you can't miss that the Big Ten is in that city. Here, it was very much like I got off the airplane and I was walking through the Las Vegas airport, and I was still kind of waiting to see something, and I didn't. You get to the resort, and you have to get from check-in to the convention center to where everything is, and you don't see any Big Ten signage until I think maybe the bottom of one of the escalators, and and it's not in a high trafficked area. So it's not somewhere that, people are going to be. James Franklin mentioned that there's not a lot of like autograph seekers and things like that. I did see a couple of Ohio State fans hanging around on Tuesday with their autograph binders. I'm sitting in like second floor of the convention center. Everything's happening on the third floor. I saw some Michigan fans walking around earlier, but it's not really the same as in Indianapolis, where there's just a lot of Big Ten people there. If you went to school in Ohio State, Michigan, Northwestern, like Illinois, Indiana, like you just end up there. So there's just more people there. So there's a little bit more buzz and things like that. It's
and
also,
what else did James say? More media members, more reporters, but people who are actually, who's dedicate their full-time job to covering their specific teams. I know Mark Brennan noted this on our message board. Very few people have covered Penn State for as long as Mark Brennan has, going back to the 1980s. He said he's never seen this low of a turnout among the Penn State beat. Fortunately, we had multiple representatives. I don't know that anybody had more than one or two people out there. A lot of outlets weren't represented at all. And I know that's just the Penn State beat. You think about all the Great Lakes area based programs and trying to find a way. Folks, I shouldn't be surprised, but this is a bit of a challenging time in our industry right now economically. So I just think you take the way of the ability for those people to get in cars and carpool and show up to this thing and really bring knowledge to the program. James Franklin, he doesn't say it much, but he missed us yesterday. he was pretty apparent about like he wants there to be more media, more reporters, more fans. And he said, hey, I've been a head coach in the SEC, and he did not shy away from saying they are whooping our butt right now and taking advantage of what is a ghost town really on the calendar for the sports year, right? Late July. What are you talking about? Well, you should be talking about the buzz for college football. They and the SEC set up shop, their circus tent, at the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta, in the heart of SEC territory. They got fans. James Franklin talked about autographing babies down there. And up here, like you said, you've got to find your way through the resort and figure out where the Big Ten situation even is located. And I just was really interesting to hear James Franklin be that emphatic about saying this is not a fit. And we got to figure out something else to put our brand out there and to make this a event that people want to be at and can be at. And so it's an interesting place for us to start this conversation versus the actual football stuff. But I think Franklin's commentary kind of resonated. It caught some steam overnight on Wednesday. And now on Thursday, I thought it was a good place for us to start.
Yeah, just from that media perspective, I did a little bit of a head count yesterday. And I think there's 8 reporters from Pennsylvania who made the trip out. In terms of outlets, you have Lions 24/7, Blue White Illustrated, Penn Live, the Center Daily Times, and then Penn State on Sports Illustrated. So those are your outlets that are here, plus one TV station, I think Fox 43. I'm really sorry if I missed anyone. It's been a busy couple of days. But so from that perspective, I mean, the Penn State beat, I think that it has one of the larger presences in the Big Ten. I know that Ohio State is always well represented at these sorts of things. You have a ton of Ohio State beat writers around on Tuesday and yesterday. Michigan goes today, so I'm sure we'll see some more of that contingent here. But overall, I mean, at some of the podiums, like Drew Allar had a really big crowd. James Franklin had a big crowd yesterday. But there hasn't really been any time where it felt like there's been like a crush, like there has been at times in Indianapolis or Chicago. I remember in 2015 or 2016 when I was covering Maryland, Jim Harbaugh was talking, and I had to shout a question, just lob it in from maybe 4 people deep about DJ Durkin, who had just gotten hired at Maryland from Michigan, and it was tough. And it hasn't really been like that here. I think that there's just overall fewer numbers. I was talking to someone on Tuesday, and we were looking around. It was pretty late, maybe 5 minutes left in the current session. And we turned and looked at Jeremiah Smith's podium, and it was like, there should never be that few people talking to Jeremiah Smith, like a future number 1 overall pick. And he had like maybe 5 or 6 people around him, 25 minutes into his session. So
Franklin basically said this needs to be a big time feel, and it wasn't.
Mhm.
This really should be the crescendo of off-season buzz, where you let it all out, and then you go back to campus and you bet on the pads and you go into preseason camp. It just doesn't seem like it was that kind of an event from James Franklin, who's now done 12 of these as a Big Ten coach, and he's done a few of them as an SEC coach. And for my money, it doesn't seem like Las Vegas is going to be a repeat return. But Daniel, I'm maybe biased as a New Jersey native and a guy who went to Rutgers, but when you added Rutgers and Maryland a decade ago, you haven't thought of maybe trying this thing out in New York City one time? You go to Las Vegas, you got no teams in Nevada. You got 2 of them in Indiana. You got 2 of them in Illinois. You got your Big Ten headquarters in Illinois. And to me, if you want to think outside the box and go West Coast with it, well, there's a little city called Los Angeles across the country that also works. Sorry, that's my rant, but I didn't have to get on a plane. I didn't have to get in the car. I didn't have to go there. But a lot of what James Franklin said kind of resonated with me. And when I got a real perception from you and Mark on how little our beat was represented out there, come on, we got to do better in this Big Ten.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the Big Ten did its basketball media days, which obviously a smaller event, but they did it in Washington, D.C. because they were playing the Big Ten tournament there later in the year. And that felt like a pretty centrally located place. Obviously, with basketball, it's a little bit more in and out, that type of deal. But yeah, I mean, when they announced this, it felt like just kind of a weird fit. And, there's just different things where it's like when you're in Indianapolis and you're doing this, it's like you're going from the hotel to Lucas Oil. And really that's it. Maybe you'll go to the bar a little bit, you'll socialize, be out at night a little bit, but it's very like back and forth. And it's Indianapolis, there's not that much else going on. Whereas like here, I was up at 4 a.m. on Tuesday to get my 6:50 flight out of Philly to get here. And so I was like pretty frazzled. And you're walking from the elevator down from the hotel rooms, and you're walking through the casino floor, you're walking through these enormous lines for people to go to the aquarium, there's kids running around everywhere. It's been really overstimulating, in kind of a funny way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and so there was a moment where I was kind of half jokingly just like, man, like I kind of wish I was in Indianapolis right now, just in terms of the.
You never thought you'd say that again. You never thought you'd say that phrase.
Only time I'm ever going to say it. But in terms of overall Big Ten feedback, I did have a conversation with someone who covers one of the West Coast schools, and they were, we were talking about Big Ten media days, and he was discussing Pac-12 media days, and he has said that in the 2 Big Ten media days that he's been to, the one thing that he really appreciates is that it's about the football. Like when the Pac-12 was doing it, I believe one year they were like in a club like during the day, and it was trying to be like this big event that had like all these different bells and whistles to it, where in reality, like you're just there to talk to these players. And so he said that he appreciated that the Big Ten, like it's like very business-like, that it's about the football. It's about, getting to Saturdays this fall, who's going to win, those sorts of things. So I think that, from that, I thought that was an interesting perspective. But I do think overall, like college football is in such a weird place that, I think that when Franklin talks about using this event as like a kickoff for the season to really kick things into gear, I think that part of it has to do with the way that college football is just kind of stuck in this weird transitional phase that we don't know really what the ending is going to be, where I think the focus should be, all right, like who you got this fall, like who are going to be your guys, what's this going to look like, how excited are you to play this team, how's this going to be, and then there's all these questions about, what is your preferred playoff structure, how many automatic bids should the Big Ten get,
what's your NIL war chest look like?
Yeah, do you have an NIL deal that hasn't gone through? Do you know what NIL Go is? Like, there's all these different things, and I understand that there is more to college football than just what happens on Saturdays. There's more to any sport than what just happens on Saturdays. That's the world that we live in, and I think that's fine. And honestly, sometimes I like it, but I think that when you're trying to build hype for a season that features all these like very impressive physical feats on the field. And a big topic of conversation is basically like clerical work.
Mm-hmm.
Like it does take a little bit away from things, a little bit. Granted, like you have to ask those questions because this is the only time you're going to get all these people in one place. So you can get a broad range of opinions. You can learn a lot about, where these coaches want to push things, where decision makers want to push things. You can get good perspective from players, from, someone who's in a program like Purdue, Rutgers, or Maryland, and then someone who is at Ohio State, Oregon, like these teams that have kind of disparate success, disparate resources. So you can get some good perspective that way. But I do think that there is an element, and that the way that the sport is right now, that is taking a little bit away from the product on the field on Saturdays. And, I think that there's a little bit of it in like the college football playoff last year, where it's like, we're talking about these bowl games, these quarterfinals, these elimination games, and like, but you still have to discuss all these other big picture topics at the same time. Like I said, it's part of the deal, and I understand it, and in a way, like I do appreciate it. But when you're talking about trying to, really generate excitement for a season, and you're trying to promote your conference and, show why it's the best, it should be. I don't think it should be these coaches think that, the 4 auto bids is a better system than the 5+11. I think it should be all these people said Jeremiah Smith is, is going to be a number 1 pick. All these players, think that Drew Allar has the potential is going to be really hard to stop this fall. It's just kind of like I think that in sports coverage in general, this is a big tangent. We'll get the ball soon, but there's so many storylines that are about like the business of the sport, or like the transactions that surround the sport, and not even like who's getting released, who's getting signed, but the transactional nature of like the TV partners, all that stuff. All that stuff is very important to the health of the sport. But I think that, that there needs to be a little bit more of a balance in terms of how much oxygen that takes up, so that you can give the oxygen to guys like Jeremiah Smith, like Drew Allar, who are going to be the ones this fall who really do elevate the conference, everything like that.
It was a big tangent, but we're talking about Big Ten Media Days, so we can talk about our industry a little bit, I think, in this conversation. We talk about Penn State football wire to wire all year on the show. So I think it's okay that we poked our heads into that a little bit, maybe brought people into that a little. I do want to note, though, there is a lot of football to discuss. And so we can get to that now. James Franklin did talk about the expectations that his team has surrounding it. I think it's nothing that anyone has shied away from in the Lasch building, as we've spoken with them, really going back to last January. They want to win a national championship. Even a couple of years ago, you weren't hearing the guys say that outright, that a national championship is the goal. It was 1-0. Not hearing a lot about 1-0 lately, Daniel. It's more about we want to be the top team in the country. And so what did you pick up, starting with James Franklin, but maybe from some of those other players, about how 2025, approaching preseason camp, maybe just feels a little bit different than it did in past seasons?
Yeah, I think that the first sign of that this year is a little bit different to me is the crowds that were around James Franklin and Drew Allar, and then the types of questions that you're getting, where it is you were so close to winning, to making the national championship last year. How has that affected things, moving forward? And I think that you saw the entertainment of that big picture stuff, and there wasn't this deflection to, well, we have Nevada in week 1. I think Zachy Wheatley at one point did a little bit of he got a question about Oregon and Ohio State, and he said, he's like, well, there is Nevada week 1 and everything, and I want you to know that that's where my focus is and everything, but and I think that was something that really stood out, across things. But I wrote about it last night, and I think the most telling thing happened was that James Franklin explicitly acknowledged the narrative around his program and the narrative around him. And I'm going to pull up his quote right now. Mark Brennan has a good video of the full exchange up on Lions 24/7. But Franklin said, he said that we're in total control of it. and in that he's talking about the perception of his program, everything like that. If we want the narrative to change, we got an opportunity to change it. If we want people to shut up, we can shut them up real easy. And I think that just kind of is throwing all the cards on the table, that like, this is a big year for James Franklin. This is a big year for this program. This is a big year for all of the stakeholders. Now, Franklin he has this rhetorical this rhetorical tool that he uses a lot, which is always when you ask what expectations is expectations at Penn State are the same every year. So this isn't anything different to me. And he did bring up, he's like, yeah, we were one drive away from playing for the national championship last year, and the people were pissed off about the season. And you're talking about a season where Penn State made the CFP semifinals. They won 13 games for the first time ever. They won 11 regular season games for the first time since 2008. They played for a Big Ten title. Like, they had all of these accomplishments, and kind of there's so much angst around it. And I think so Franklin, I think, knows that, and he can use that to show that, like, hey, like, you guys are picking us number one. Like, we expect to be there every year. This is what our standard is. This is what we're trying to meet every year. But at the same time, I think that when he talks about changing narratives, shutting people up, that stood out to me as a little bit different, a little bit addressing things. And that was like 4 or 5 questions into his session. And it was kind of like someone in a previous question, someone had brought up, like, how does it feel when people ring up that you're 1-15 or whatever it is against AP top 25 teams? Like, basically, like, how does it feel that when people
top
talk
10.
about you?
I don't want people taking that to Twitter. Was it top 10, not top 25? Let's be careful.
There's so many rankings, so many different distinctions. I just try to see as one win. I don't count the losses at this point. We know it's a lot. So I think that having all that come up, and it kind of got to a point pretty early in that session where he just kind of laid it all out there, and it's a lot of candor. And I think that it's a unique approach from this team for this year, and one that I appreciate, because like, we're all talking about the elephant in the room, and if everything we hear is like, well, you got to get through Nevada, then you got to get through FIU, then you got to get through Villanova. We all know it's there. So I think that having that acknowledgement, and in the past we hear certain players acknowledge it over the course of a season in different ways, but to have that kind of right now, I think that sets the tone for what the expectations are this year.
I think we picked up on a shift in our conversations with the players last year. Kobe King, Nick Dawkins, some of those guys who were key components of the leadership of that locker room in 2024 they're openly talking about national championship goals, Big Ten championship goals. Whereas I got the feeling a few years ago, it would be more, we're trying to go 1-0 against Nevada, and then we'll see what happens after that. Now it feels like everything's on the table for a conversation. Double-edged sword of this, of course, as Franklin says, you can shut everybody up. But if they fail to do that this year, the volume from the other side, the external volume, is going to be louder than ever before about Penn State and about James Franklin. And so it could go one way or the other. It's going to be entertaining to follow regardless. And I think the point that James Franklin made about internally the expectations are to do this every year, that's great. But he also brought up something yesterday that I think kind of goes in the face of that a little bit. He brought up that they only had one NFL draft pick the year after they won the 2016 Big Ten championship. It was Chris Godwin to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think in round 3. He says he expects this roster to produce 10 to 12 draft picks. And so this goes back to his other comment and saying, combined, the personnel of this Penn State squad, staff-wise and roster-wise, is the best it's been, he said, from a depth, talent, and experience perspective. And so when he says these kind of things out loud, it just removes a lot of potential excuses from the table for Penn State this year. And it's hard to find a lot of excuses, right? I mean, it could be maybe a guy doesn't develop here, a guy doesn't develop there. But if you're going to tell the world that you're going to have a dozen draft picks, you got the talent.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting framing from Franklin to really look at things holistically, because we know that we're close to the program. We are around it every day. So I think we're really aware of the talent that is on the coaching staff. I think that Franklin and Penn State picked up a little bit more national attention in terms of their coaching staff with the 2 moves this offseason, adding Jim Knowles, adding Stan Drayton. I think that really drew some eyes to what Franklin has built, and especially coupled with getting Andy Kotelnicki 2 years ago. So I think from that perspective, you see the framework is there to have that success. And then you do look at these players. I mean, we talk about it where it's like, in terms of where are the weaknesses on this team. And when we had the conversation about maybe projecting where freshmen could play, that you look at it and there's no holes where it's like someone needs to step up right there. It's maybe wide receiver, but you made those moves in the transfer portal. And so you immediately address that. Wherever there have been maybe perceived weaknesses, we've seen Penn State address it, or they've developed guys who have really stepped in. And so I think top to bottom, this is just a very, very talented team. The number that James Franklin gave, 10 to 12, was an interesting one. I just looked it up while we were talking. Ohio State had 14 drafted off their national championship team the year after, and Michigan had 13. So it is, and I think, some of those Alabama teams and Georgia teams, they were probably I think they're in like the upper teens. So I think from that perspective, you still see where there's some program development that they're still working towards, some talent development, talent retention, that you're trying to get to maybe up that number of draft picks. But I just think from where Penn State is right now, when you look at this roster, what they can accomplish, where guys are going to be playing next year, it's just such a talented team. And the marriage of that with the staff and the talent that James Franklin has accumulated there, I think is just really positive and sets them up very well.
Franklin was also asked about replacing All-American tight end Tyler Warren. It's been a topic of conversation throughout the year after we saw him go 100-plus catches, earn All-American status, top 10 finish in the Heisman Trophy, first-round draft status. It's a lot of shoes to fill there. But James Franklin likes what he has at tight end, and that's not been a secret. He reasserted that on a national stage on Wednesday and at the main podium, and he brought up three names. It's the three names we've brought up to you. It's Andrew Rapier coming off an injury. It's Khalil Dinkins, who was the primary backup to Warren last year, got a lot of run. And then it's also the sophomore, Luke Reynolds, who's got all the athleticism in the world, and we're really curious to see what it looks like with some more opportunities for him. But I thought he took it to a different place as well in mentioning that they need to get those touches to Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. But what stood out to me was he brought up the receivers. He was saying, it's going to be getting a bunch of guys involved. It's not going to be replacing, 1-for-1 with Tyler Warren or even 2-for-1. He says the group effort. He went to other position groups. But when he brought up wide receiver, he only mentioned three names on a national kind of stage. And we're well aware that James Franklin, when he goes to list names in any press conference, he thinks very strategically about it. He doesn't want to leave guys out. He's always cautious about that. But in this instance, he brought them up because he brought them in, but the three transfer receivers were the three guys he mentioned at receiver. He talked about Trevor Pena, he talked about Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson. He mentioned that Hudson was a captain and that Pena was a captain at Syracuse, and that Ross did a lot of good things on the road at Iowa last fall. And so to me, he brings up the two obvious guys at running back. He brings up the names that we knew at tight end in those three at the top of the depth chart. But the fact that he didn't go any further at wide receiver, I think that was interesting. I think it says a lot about how they feel about these three. If they can go 3 for 3 on hitting on the transfer portal, it can be huge for Drew Allar in this offense. But I think it also might express that these guys have established themselves. And even though Trevor Pena doesn't have a practice under his belt, James Franklin is not walking on eggshells and saying, these are three guys that we view at the front of our wide receiver conversation right now. He didn't say that verbatim. And maybe if you go back and bring up Liam Clifford again, he would, but he didn't. And so I just thought that was something that I took away from that a little bit, and that he was willing to put that out on a national stage and talk about replacing Tyler Warren. Brought up the three tight ends, brought up the two running backs, but brought up three guys who have not yet caught a pass in a Penn State uniform.
I think when you talk about that wide receiver group, I think it lines up with what Franklin has been talking a lot about this offseason in terms of getting production out of the transfer portal, because you want guys who can produce. And so if you have that track record of production, bringing them in, I think you know what you have a little bit. And you talk about the Penn State returners at wide receiver. None of them have produced. I think Liam Clifford is the leading career returning receiver, and it's pretty modest statistics. Tyseer Denmark only has a couple catches. Caden Saunders didn't play last year. Anthony Ivy has had only a couple cameos. Like, the guys who are coming back, like, there's not a lot of production there. And James Franklin wants production. That's something that they looked for in the transfer portal. And I think they feel that they found it in terms of the numbers that, Devontae Ross and Trevor Pena put up with their schools. Kyron Hudson's statistics are a little bit more modest, but he has a track record of experience in the Pac-12, in the Big Ten, a little bit of a different type of wide receiver too, from a body type perspective. So I think that in my mind, that's where that went when James Franklin is mentioning these guys specifically. I think that he's emphasizing that, production really matters, and what you've done is really important. I will say with the tight ends, he mentioned Khalil Dinkins first. And I think that kind of lines up with how they feel about Dinkins and what he's able to do, and the role that he's going to have. But overall, I think that the framing that he used is pretty similar to what we've heard and what we heard last year, not really directly in the context of Tyler Warren, but when Franklin would get asked those questions about, do you want to lean on this many 2 tight end sets, or, do you wish you could have 3 and 4 wide receiver sets more? And the framing of, the number 2 tight end is competing with that number 3 wide receiver for touches. That number 3 running back is probably competing with a number 3 wide receiver, number 4 wide receiver, things like that. So I think a lot of that really lined up with what we've heard from Franklin in the past and how he frames things. But I do think it is notable with how things are set up.
Of course, Drew Allar is tasked with making all those pass catchers look good and vice versa. And he is a senior now, 2 years of starting quarterback under his belt as Penn State, and all the attention on him. I mean, you look at the quarterbacks in the Big Ten, and you don't come up with a lot that you project as, right now. There's some young ones that we're keeping an eye on, but he's very much the center of attention across the conference at quarterback. And you talk about guys who could be near the top of that NFL draft board next year. He's one of the 4 or 5 names that gets bounced around. He's got some work to do to build his stock in that department, but came back for a reason. James Franklin referred to it as unfinished business for Drew Allar, who later confirmed that was a key element in him returning to campus. But I think what was interesting here is a couple things from James Franklin. One, continuing to say that leadership is a key stride for him. It's not just the confidence level and being able to be that leader for your locker room, but he said he's been very willing to have tough conversations with his teammates. I think that's something that comes with maturity, something that comes with kind of taking your own lumps in game action. And he needs to be able to be that confrontational leader. We've talked about that before. It's good to be, a guy who can, hoot and holler when things are going good. Sometimes you got to be a confrontational leader. And I thought Sean Clifford excelled at that. We heard a little bit about that from Landon Tengwall in the last episode, and where he thinks Drew Allar could elevate his game a little bit there. But I thought that was promising to hear from James Franklin. And we saw a step forward from Drew Allar on the field last year in terms of how he was dictating things to his teammates, how he was handling opponents, and some of that with his bravado that we really liked. At times it went away. We didn't really see that against Notre Dame on the biggest stage of the season. But Daniel, the other thing that stood out to me was that James Franklin says he's finally saw Drew Allar with his shirt off. He said, make of that comment what you will, but maybe Allar was a little uncomfortable about his body appearance. We saw some video that Brad Mendler, his QB trainer, put out from campus recently on social media, where Allar and Ethan Grunkemeyer are out there slinging the ball on the practice field, and Allar's shirtless. And there's not a lot of flab when he's throwing that ball. And he's always kind of been baby-faced, maybe, kind of a big kid type. Looked a little bit different yesterday when I was watching some of that video of him. We've seen him around campus, of course, but certainly more defined, and a guy that Mendler told us when he was on this podcast, as he's been mentoring again through another offseason, he said he's going to do more things with his feet and behind the line of scrimmage and ahead of the line of scrimmage than what we saw last year. And James Franklin has acknowledged they're going to need that. And so is Chuck Losey, the strength coach.
Yeah, this goes back to, I think, what we heard before last season, where the goal was to get Allar a little bit more leaner. I know that he played in 2022, 2023. He was up in the 240s for his weight. I think he might have been like 245, 246 at one point. And now he's back down into the 230s. And I think that really showed last year in terms of his mobility, the way that he was able to move around, things like that. And on top of that, I don't really think he sacrificed any of his strength, despite slimming down a little bit. I talked to Mateo Uyunglele yesterday and just asked him, the Oregon outside linebacker, and just asked him about his impressions of Drew Allar from the Big Ten championship game. And I forgot that he was the one that had Allar in the grasp when he threw that touchdown pass to Harrison Wallace in the fourth quarter of that game. And he said that, he thought he had him down, that he, had him wrapped up, thought he was going to bring him to the ground, but Allar was so strong and able to, while in the grasp, having his jersey pulled, get the ball out with enough zip to get it to Wallace in a tight window. And so I think that we saw last year that even though Allar has slimmed down, those things, that he's still a really strong athlete. And I think that is probably, more important than the bulk of having that, of looking on paper and seeing, whoa, like 6'5", 245, that's a big guy. You can be 6'5", 230, 235 and still really have that type of strength. And I think that that's something that is really going to pay off for Penn State. If Allar can do some things with his legs, keep plays alive, extend plays, escape the pocket, I think that can add another dimension to Penn State and maybe give him a little bit more confidence to, keep things alive, to trust his instincts, what he's feeling out there, as opposed to maybe bailing on a play early and taking that safe incompletion instead of trying to make things happen. I think that's something with Allar that we've really seen these past couple of years. It wasn't as magnified last year as it was in 2023 in terms of taking risks. But I think that all of this stuff, reshaping the body, having the experience, being stronger, I think that all factors into, being comfortable out there to make tough decisions and having that confidence in yourself.
You stack another year with Andy Kotelnicki, with your quarterbacks coach, Danny O'Brien. I mean, every piece seems to be in place for a big launch here. And this is a guy who's done a lot of good things already, put himself in a good spot in the eyes of NFL evaluators and has won a number of games for Penn State, but they want to see those defining wins. And that, that's for James Franklin as well. You bring up the records, and when you're the QB outside of the head coach, you're going to be, scrutinized for wins and losses and on the biggest stages of them all. But just going back to Drew Allar's rushing ability really quick, 36 first down runs last year, and he had 17 runs of 10 yards or more, none longer than 22. But he did some things, moved the chains, kept some drives alive. I think what's going to even be more important than what he is doing beyond the line of scrimmage, Daniel, in that regard, is buying time for these receivers, for his tight ends, for his running backs, and embracing a little bit more improvisation. And like you said, kind of feeling more comfortable to take some of those chances because how well scripted you are within your offense. You're on the same page with your teammates. So we'll see what it looks like for Drew Allar. What stood out from Drew himself? Because he's a guy that you heard a lot from. I know you're working on a story over at Lions247.com today. It'll be up probably by the time this podcast is live. So from Drew himself, going into his final year here at Penn State, what were your biggest takeaways? You're muted, Dan.
I think we heard someone who was really confident and really thoughtful with what he was saying. He got asked the question about if he'd sat down with Jim Knowles and gone over how Ohio State had scouted him the past 2 years, and he gave a very long and in-depth answer about learning from that and how he thinks that's going to help him moving forward. He also had an interesting line of questioning about being in the spotlight and being a very, very notable person, I guess, in college football. He was asked, like, have you heard from people who have lost money on you gambling? And he's like, yeah, like my phone number has leaked. He's like, I've gotten requests on Venmo from people. He talked about, getting a lot of attention in that way. And he said that it's one of those things where, people tell him these things. I think he said that he was back home and someone told him that they had money on him to win the Heisman. And he was basically just like, okay, like, cool. And so he said that having this sort of attention on him is, it's different. And I think that that's something too that James Franklin has talked about in terms of, there's really nothing like being the starting quarterback at a major college football program, especially in today's day and age. Franklin always says that he and Allar have that shared experience that other people in the program don't really have. So I thought it is interesting to hear Drew kind of, bring the curtain up a little bit on what that's like, what that experience is of being in the spotlight. He also talked about his decision to come back for another year. I think that Franklin had said that the feedback was that he would be a first round pick. Allar said that the feedback that he got was more scattered. That was the word he used, scattered, in terms of having a pretty wide range of outcomes. He also said that he was asked too, like, there was some buzz during that college football playoff run where, hey, like, if things break a certain way, that he could go, and that it might be, his stock might be the highest it'll ever be. And he said that he was going into the playoff, it was 90% that he would be back, that that he was planning on being.
That because he had already announced, because Bo's gone, and he says, don't worry, I'm back for 2025. But if internally he's thinking 90%, to put out that announcement, he made have, you can hang yourself out to dry a little bit there. We didn't get to that point, but that's interesting to hear from Drew, looking back at it.
Well, I'd have to pull up the announcement, but the language in that announcement was very vague and very.
That's also true.
It had every out built into it.
Yeah, that's what
you have to do. But I think that it shows someone who's very self-aware of the situation that he is in, both in terms of for Penn State, but also for himself personally and his future. I think that, and it's also like, it's the smart thing too, where it's like, you never rule anything completely out. And that, like, you have to be open to things changing, that you can have this plan, and then suddenly you catch fire, and it's like, okay, like, this is the best thing for me right now. And this is a decision that has to be made. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Overall, like I said, a ton of Ohio State media here. So Allar got a ton of questions about the Ohio State games the past couple of years, getting to come back to the Horseshoe again. One line of questioning that I thought was pretty interesting, and one that we haven't heard before, was about Drew's Cleveland Browns fandom growing up. He said that his favorite Brown was probably Joe Hayden, the defensive back. And he said that, from the time that he was, I think he said 7 or 8, until he got to Penn State, he didn't miss a Browns home game. And that
poor kid.
that he hasn't been to one since he started playing college. But his dad, and I don't think he said that he doesn't think his dad has been either, but his dad still has the tickets. It's still something that I think was very formative in growing up in Northeast Ohio, having that team, being a fan, and I think falling in love with football. So that was something that I thought was interesting. Like, that's never really come up, with Allar in our media settings. And that's one of the beauties of, these media days, is you get people coming in from different angles, and you can get some different things.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there. Him going back to the Horseshoe, he's trying not to join Sean Clifford as a quarterback from Ohio who went 0 against the Buckeyes. That's a tough pill to swallow, as much as they've accomplished. And Clifford left with just about every record individually at quarterback, but he was 0-4 against Ohio State, and he was on the record as saying you come to Penn State to beat the Buckeyes. And Drew Allar talked about that being a game that he came to Penn State for. So he'll get one more shot at it. His first 2 tries were not pretty for Penn State, but obviously November 1st going to be a big one to circle for the Nittany Lions. Nick Dawkins, a 6-year senior center, and 5th-year senior safety Zaki Wheatley were the other 2 Nittany Lions in attendance. Every program brings 3 players out to this on an annual basis. No surprise that those 2 guys were involved as leaders and as returning starters. Any key takeaways? We're not going to give them as much spotlight as we did at the QB1, but that's understandable. What could you maybe pass along from Nick and Zaki that stood out to you?
I think both of them had really interesting perspective in terms of their maturity and how they've grown over the course of their careers. We know Nick Dawkins and his personality. He's always been really outgoing, always been so gregarious, and I think has always been a pretty polished speaker. But he said that now in his 6th year, like he's a man now, that he felt like he's really grown up in the program. And he said that he came back because it was the unfinished business, that he did not want to leave on that note last year. He did not, want that feeling to really stay with him after his Penn State career. I thought that was pretty interesting to him. I had to sit down with him thanks to CBS Sports, and I asked him about his relationship to the state college community. And he said that it's really the only way that he knows how to be, that when he is in a place, he wants to embrace it. He wants to connect with the people who are there. He wants to give back. I asked him too about winning the Warfel Trophy last year in terms of the community service. And I asked them, what did your teammates think about that? Because I feel like that's something that might fly a little bit under the radar. And Dawkins said that this year that everyone wanted to know how they could be involved in his book bag drive, that the interest that he got from his teammates after, having that award, getting that notoriety has helped his foundation, which I thought was really cool to hear from Dawkins. Wheatley, he had a similar thing in talking about his arc in terms of his maturity and how he's grown up. I think that that's something that has been touched on, from James Franklin, from Anthony Poindexter, and from Chuck Losey this year in terms of, after his redshirt sophomore year, that was the year that we saw him get benched in that Indiana game after giving up that touchdown.
One snap, I believe, the first defensive snap gone. And we were like, what's going to happen next? And of course, to his credit, comes back in a big way in 2024.
Exactly. And so that, going into the offseason a year ago, that he had the, sit down with Franklin, with Poindexter, and, whatever that message was really resonated with him. So I think that, having that, growing up in that way, it was interesting to talk to him about that because he's very reflective on it, acknowledged it, and has basically been like, I was a kid when I got here, and now he's grown up a lot. I think that he's fun to talk to because Allar is so polished as a speaker. Dawkins is a one of a kind speaker, but Wheatley is one of those guys that can be a little bit more of a wild card, where every once in a while you see the gears turning in terms of his media training and, trying to think through a couple things and what he wants to say. But I think that he's someone that you look at, not quite to the level of Jalen Reed when you talk about reliable narrators and guys who are going to tell you the truth no matter what. But I think Wheatley is one of those guys that, the way that he looks at the game and the way that he looks at things is that, if you ask him a question, like he's going to give you an honest answer to it, which we really appreciate.
Wheatley, perhaps as much as anybody on this Penn State roster, Daniel, I'm curious if he does, build on what he did last year and has a really outstanding season, what his NFL draft outlook, because he's a guy that just does, he's not in any kind of mock drafts right now. He's not on these, top 50 or top 100 prospect lists that I've seen, but he's somebody that, given his versatility and his physical ability, and by the time he gets done playing ball, no one's played more snaps in their career, special teams, defense, offense, than Zakee Wheatley through the 2024 season. So he's going to have a really interesting resume for these scouts to evaluate down the road. I think he has a major ceiling too, maybe to tap into.
Yeah, that's something. I was only with him for a little bit of the 30 minutes that he was available to everyone. And so I want to go back through and see if the NFL stuff came up. I think it was a conversation based on when we talked to him in the spring, that he was considering going. And I think the feedback that they got was that, it would help him to come back. But I think Poindexter said that, he would have gotten drafted. And that, he has those tools and everything. I think that he's one of those guys where he can really make a name for himself nationally. Like if you're an external, observer and you see the announcements from guys saying that they're coming back, I'm sure that, maybe if you don't know the Penn State program well and you see Wheatley announce that he's coming back for his 5th season, that you might have that, oh, well, where was he going to go? Type reaction that we have sometimes. But I do think that, it'll be I think he, was a draftable prospect last year, and I think he can really boost the stock. And, James Franklin likes to say that there's a lot of guys who aren't being talked about nationally or aren't being talked about a lot. But I do think that Wheatley really does fit into that based on the position he plays, who's come before him, that lineage, what, having, KJ Winston, Jalen Reed, being out a little bit from those shadows a little bit. I think that he is someone who I do think falls into that. He can surprise some people. A lot of people are going to learn his name this year.
Daniel, I know you're still working through your notebook out there in Las Vegas, and you got a flight to catch, and you're going to have a lot of content over at Lions 24/7 from this experience. But anything else you'd like to share here? Maybe the commentary from Ohio State players on Jim Knowles and what he meant to their progress, and overall, just any nuggets you gleaned from Penn State people, from non-Penn State people that you might forget about by the time we circle back for another podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with what I sent you guys yesterday. As I talked to Preston Stone, who was the SMU backup quarterback last year. He's going to start for Northwestern this year, so he's going to get to come back to Beaver Stadium. So I called him at the very end of his media session, and I asked him, like, what do you remember about that game being in Beaver Stadium? And he said, I think the quote was, "It was cold and we got our ass kicked." And I talked to another Penn State media member, and that was Preston Stone's line. He said that multiple times when he was asked about it.
I mean, isn't that the way you remember it?
Well, I wasn't that cold because we were up in that press box. But yeah, so, and he talked about that it was a really fun experience as a college football player, even though they lost, and he's looking forward to coming back, with Northwestern. And I think already having been there, he said he knows it's the homecoming game, so he knows that there's a little bit extra in there to it. So he's looking forward to that experience. Another thing that stood out to me was I talked to some of the Maryland players on Tuesday. I asked them about how that game ended. We know how upset Mike Loxley was when Tyseer Denmark scores that late touchdown. The Maryland players were just kind of like, it's the game. You got to stop people, if you want to. Maryland safety Jalen Husky, he was a high school teammate with Jalen Harvey. So I got some, really interesting feedback on what it was like to be around a young Jalen Harvey and what his attitude was and how that got him here. Got some fun feedback on what it was like to play with Chop Robinson at Quince Orchard outside of DC. I thought that was a good nugget. But yeah, catching up with the Ohio State guys and asking them about Jim Knowles. Like, I think it's very clear that they respect him as a football mind. Caleb Downs said that he really appreciated, having that type of authority figure around. I think the way that Downs framed it is that in certain situations, you need someone to be there and say, this is the way we're going to do it. Like, this is the setup. And that he appreciated that Jim Knowles was like that this is the way we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it. Sonny Styles, the linebacker, he said that, Tuesday to Friday, Knowles is on them about every single mistake. He's very exacting in practice, very particular, but that's because Knowles says that on Saturday, anything that happens on Saturday, that's Knowles' fault. That's not a player's fault. That if something happens, it's because Knowles didn't put them in the right position to be there. During the week, that's on the players, to embrace everything, go through it. But Saturdays, all that responsibility falls on Knowles. So that's a pretty interesting perspective. So I think those were the pretty good conversations I had. I've really tried to talk to players from other teams. I tried to do some research on different connections that guys might have had. But it's nice. Like, I appreciate to talk about things like Rutgers quarterback Ethan Kaliak-Manis. His first career start was in that whiteout in 2022 for Minnesota. And he said that was a very formative moment in his career, and an experience that has really stuck with him and that he learned a lot from. So some really good perspectives. I'm going to try to put together some sort of notebook to tie all these different quotes, different stories together for our readers on Lions 24/7 and on that live updates thread. As I transcribe something, as I'm writing a story, I'm just dropping it in there. And so hopefully we'll have everything in there at some point.
And speaking of whiteouts, Dan Lanning, Oregon's coach, talking about that opportunity that Oregon's going to face. And that's the beauty of it now. We're just about done talking about all the Big Ten teams and all the big picture stuff. It's going to be talking about scoreboards, win-loss records, and all the actual things that are tangible for us here. And we're just about a week and a half away from getting what we think will be Penn State Media Day and what we're used to, which means a lot of players, a lot of coaches, and the floodgates are really going to open for us at Lions 24/7 in terms of communication and what we're going to have for you in terms of content at lions247.com. We're back on the practice field very soon, and if you're not following our VIP coverage, you're going to miss out on a ton of stuff that doesn't find its way to this podcast. Hop on board, 30% off VIP coverage right now, Lions247.com, or $1 for 1 month. And this is a really good month to take a longer look leading up to the August 30th kickoff against Nevada. Daniel, there's plenty of unanswered questions. We'll get to them next week and beyond. In the meantime, I hope you get home safe from Las Vegas and you have an opportunity to go talk to some more Big Ten coaches and players here on Thursday afternoon. So I'm curious to see what you get out of that.
Thanks, Tyler. It's really feels like football season now. I think it's another day closer. It's our unofficial kickoff, and I'm really looking forward to it.
All right, great stuff. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
Daniel and Mark did great work down in Vegas. We'll get them back here to Central PA, and we will all be over to Penn State practice facilities next week. Can you believe it? Going to be fun to follow. We're going to be fun to talk about and write about. Buckle up because it's a big season ahead. And like Daniel said, Big Ten Media Days does have this feel of the unofficial start of football season here in Happy Valley, and we're happy about that. So we'll be with you again soon. 2 more episodes coming your way on the Lions 24/7 podcast. Again, I encourage you, if you missed it, former Nittany Lions offensive lineman Landon Tengwall was on with us for a full hour earlier this week in an episode that dropped on Tuesday. Check that one out for a deeper look into this current Penn State squad. For now, stepping aside on behalf of Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.